Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Was Gott tut, das ist wohlgetan, which translates to what God does, that is done well. We've looked at this particular text in the past. This is just a different harmonization, and it's actually a very interesting harmonization as we sort of bridge the gap between the first and second systems, but other than that, it's a pretty straightforward chorale. We'll just hop right into the analysis. So 1 sharp in the key signature, that's probably implying G major. We start on G, we end on G. So that's why I reached that conclusion. We start off with our 1 chord, some passing tones in the inner voices before we get another G major chord, G, B, D, and G. No need to reanalyze. We then have F sharp, A, D, and A. Probably the most common opening chord progression is a 1 to 5, 6, 5, and then it usually goes to 1, but here we have it going to not G minor, E, E, G, and B, so a slight variation on what we would typically expect, but still very similar. We then have D, E, G, and C natural. However, I think this D is an accented non-chord tone, and instead this is C, E, G, and C natural, which is a 4 chord, C major. We then have B, D, G, and D. That's G major in first inversion. That's a 1-6 chord. Passing tone in the bass. Non-chord tone, little tiny passing tone here. This B is a chord tone, so no need to mark it before we get D, A, F sharp, and D, which is a 5 chord. D major. Delayed 7th here in the melody. This D is a chord tone, no need to mark it. And then we have G major in root position, our tonic triad. Imperfect authentic cadence because the melody does not contain the tonic of the scale. And as we look ahead, we have a phrase that ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G, so no looking for any modulations here. It's all diatonic tones, no chromaticism. Here we have C, C, G, and E. That's C major in root position, that's a 4 chord. Passing 7th in the tenor. D, A, F sharp, and D. That's D major in root position. That's a 5 chord. And then we have E, G, E, and C. A bit of a deceptive progression here. That's 4, 6, C major over E. And when we link 4, 6 going to 1 ascending, because this is a 1 chord we get on the next beat, G, B, D, and B, tonic triad, we typically get the leading tone connecting the 6 and the tonic, and sometimes we get a fully voiced 7 chord like we do in this case, F sharp, A, E, and C, which is F sharp diminished, or more specifically F sharp minor 7 flat 5. So we have a bit of a subdivision of the harmonic rhythm 4, 7, 1. Passing tone in the tenor, neighbor tone in the melody before we get B, D, G, and B. That is another tonic triad, so no need to reanalyze. We'll just change the figured bass to first inversion. Then we have a passing tone in the bass as well. We then have D, D, G, and A. This is still implying a 5 chord, but this is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. The G resolves down to F sharp. This C natural is a non-chord tone. This B is a non-chord tone. Then on the harmonic rhythm, at the point of the alto's resolution, we get C introduced, so we can just say that that's also a 5-7 chord there. No need to reanalyze, just change the figured bass. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it as well. And we cadence on G major, tonic triad, G, B, D, and G. Alright, looking ahead, we have a short phrase. It's a half cadence in the key of G major before all of our harmonic shenanigans, and we have to start theorizing what's going on. We start off with a 1 chord, G major, G, B, G, and D. No need to reanalyze. We then have C major, C, C, G, and E. That's a 4 chord in root position. Passing tone in the tenor, C sharp, E, A, and E, which is A7 over C sharp. A major over C sharp. I was looking at this G right here, which is a passing 7th, so this would just be 5, 6 of 5, because D is our 5 and A is the dominant of our 5. And then we have D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. And this sounds like a half cadence to me because the melody sounds like it wants to resolve down to G. However, it's also typical of half cadences in Bach's chorales to have the fifth of the chord in the melody, not always, but often. And then we have a really interesting chord progression here. First we have F sharp minor, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A. And I had to go back into the chorale and make sure that this was correct. This feels very sudden, very abrupt, but if we take into context what's going on in the rest of the chorale, we arrive at a B chord here. So I feel like this is like an extended tonicization of B somehow. However, what this is missing is that if this F sharp triad were diatonic to the key of G major, it would be C natural and not C sharp. And if it were diatonic, or maybe not diatonic, but if it were the expected F sharp triad in the key of B minor, we would have A sharp, but we have A natural, and it's not uncommon for us to see minor fives in Bach's music. It's just interesting how we see it manifest in this context, not once, but twice. So I think we do have a bit of a modulation to the key of B minor here. The more that I listen to it, this D kind of sounds like the third of the scale now, albeit brief, but I don't really think there's a very elegant way of analyzing this using conventional cadential terms, and because this phrase is so short, there are compounding factors that make this phrase difficult to analyze due to the fact that a modulation has to occur over the span of 4 beats, and typically modulations require a bit of preparation. They don't just happen spontaneously. They can, it's uncommon and kind of fights my intuition. But when we see this C sharp here, it's unusual. So I think this D chord's functioning as a pivot chord. You could analyze this as a direct modulation as well, but 3 going to some sort of 5 is a relatively normal progression in Bach's music. Not the most, but it's not uncommon. Here we have F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A, and like we were just discussing, it's an F sharp minor chord, which would be minor 5. And if your tonal brain is saying no, that 5 chords are supposed to be major, well, you'd typically be right, but we don't always see them, and the majority of the time we see them used in cadential situations, but even here we're going to see a minor 5 chord in a non-cadential situation. So this F sharp minor chord is going to be 5, and then we have a really interesting suspension here. So we have C sharp, B, F sharp, and D. Now, what I think is happening here is that this is a 1 chord in root position, our B minor. So we have 3, 5, 1 minor, but still the idea of 5 going to 1 is there. And then we get the A sharp on the offbeat, but I think this C sharp is actually a suspension that resolves to this B right here. So we have a 9/8 suspension in the bass that turns into a 9/6 because the bass changes, but we get the A sharp on this beat along with the C sharp as well. So the passing tone in the bass, this enclosure right here, the C sharp and the A sharp are surrounding the tone that's being resolved to. So the chord turns into B minor over D sharp, over D natural. I said D sharp because I was thinking ahead. So this is, we don't need to reanalyze. This is another B minor chord, just the bass changes to D, D, B, F sharp, and D. However, we have a cadence here, which I think could be analyzed in one of 2 ways, and we really don't have the vocabulary, or we don't have a term that qualifies this this cadence. Sorry, I forgot the word cadence for a second, because here we had cadence on E minor. And to me, I think there are a couple of different ways you can analyze it. To me, it sounds like we're still in the key of G major. It sounds very similar in effect to the subdominant cadences that I've talked about in my videos in the past, where it sounds like 1 going to 4. But because I've been trying to use consistent vocabulary in my analyses, consistent with the vocabulary that I've learned to analyze, there really isn't a term that plainly describes 1 going to 4, but ipso facto, the 1 going to 4 is also the same as 5 going to 1 in the key of the subdominant. Even though the subdominant's not being involved here, we have 2 chords, 1 going to another, that are a fifth apart, but neither of them are really functioning like a tonic. It still feels like we're thinking in terms of G. However, we could look at it in terms of kind of like an imperfect authentic cadence as well, which is what I'm leaning more towards. However, I think, maybe calling it like a plagal cadence would be effective as well. Even though it's 5 going to 1, there's no leading tone, which is what makes it feel kind of flat. It makes it feel not as permanent. Effectively, what he's doing here is just a sequence, right? He's going from 1 to 5, then like 3 to 6. So there's like this scaffolding of chords going on, like going around the scale and exhausting chords in somewhat of a sequential fashion. But regardless, let me get to the analysis. So I'm going to say that he goes to the key of E minor briefly here, and this is now 5-6. That gets turned into 5-3, and remember, this is not a major 5, it's a minor 5 before we cadence on 1, E minor, E, B, E, and G, and that's what makes it imperfect authentic. Now what I hear is actually an alternative analysis. I think we're going to the key of G here. I think it's even valid to argue that this entire phrase is in the key of G, and that C sharp is just like an anomaly, like we're just tonicizing B over counterpoint rather than over like purely vertical chords. But I think this very easily could be 3-6 that turns into 5-3, the B minor being our mediant, and then cadencing on 6. So not a deceptive progression because, well, B minor doesn't really have doesn't really project or doesn't traject a particular direction in which we're a cadential direction, that is. We would maybe expect the dominant to come afterwards, but we wouldn't expect it to be a pre-final cadential chord, which is why we have to sort of expand our possibilities in terms of how I would go about analyzing this. Regardless, that was a long-winded rant. I think either of these analyses are valid. Saying we're in the key of G, saying we're in the key of E, I think they're both valid. They're all possibilities, and I guess that's what matters, is that we're exploring different possibilities. But this is definitely the analytical sort of hallmark of the chorale. We have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major at the end of the next phrase, and this E minor that we get here, E, G, E, and B, is functioning like the supertonic in the key of D major, passing 7th in the bass before we get C sharp, A, E, and A, which is A major over C sharp. That is our dominant in first inversion, A major over C sharp. Passing tone in the tenor, we then get B, C sharp, E, and G, this B being an accented non-chord tone, just like how we see it here on beat 4 of the first phrase. So it's actually A, C sharp, E, and G, so no need to reanalyze. We could just do 7-5-3 here, changing the figure bass because it is a complete 7 chord. We then have D, A, E, and F sharp, another really interesting chord. So I think what we can infer here is that a 1 chord's being implied, but this E is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. But in Bach fashion, he interrupts the suspension by continuing the chord progression regardless. So this E is just like this really beautiful 9th going on in the chord. This C sharp's a passing 7th, this E is a neighbor tone, and instead of getting the resolution, we get the suspension resolution, but the bass continues downward, so the D does go where we expect it to, but it goes to, it becomes the 3rd in our B minor chord, which is 6, B, B, D, and F sharp, with a passing 7th in the bass. And as we get ready for the cadence, we have a pretty normal cadence. We have G, B, D, and E natural. That's E minor 7 flat 5, or sorry, E minor 7 over G. That's a 2-6-5 chord. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. We then have A, C sharp, and E. That's A major in root position. That's our dominant, which we would expect, passing 7th in the tenor before we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D. And this really does sound like a modulation to the key of D because we have C sharps throughout the phrase, as opposed to our half cadence we had here where C sharp was really only introduced prior to the cadential chord. And then we're getting ready for our final phrase where it ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G, and I think we just straight ahead start in the key of G. This D could be considered our dominant in the key of G. It's in a chord that aligns with the next phrase. and that goes to B, B, F sharp, and did I read that right? Yeah, B, B, F sharp, and D. So a deceptive progression, B minor, is what we would not expect here. We would expect our tonic in maybe first inversion here if B was in the bass, but here we get 3. So we have F sharp instead of G here. But then that F sharp, that leading tone right there, resolves like we would expect on the next beat, but instead of G major, we get E minor, which is what we would expect after a 3 chord anyways. E, B, G, and C. I'm so sorry. We have the makings of an E minor chord here, but the C in the melody turns it into a C major 7 over E, which is 4, 6, 5. And then we have some non-chord tones going on here, a passing tone, a neighbor tone, and an escape tone, F sharp, A, and C natural, which is another F sharp diminished chord. This time just a triad, not a 7th chord like we have here, but notice how it's being used in passing the same way, where we have a 4-6 chord. In this case it's a 4-6-5, but still a 4-6 chord is its foundation. And then we go to G major, G, B, D, and B. So this 3 chord spins us off into another progression, prolongs it. That's what the deceptive progression does in the context of like a non-cadential situation. You have some passing tones in the inner voices, just like how we started off with. We then have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our dominant, D major in root position, that's a 5 chord. Passing 7th in the bass, B, D, G, and B, that's G major over B, that's a tonic triad in first inversion. Escape tone in the melody, this G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have a longer figure here with like some inner voice rhythmic unison, but a little bit of opposite oblique motion. That's what I was looking for, contrary motion. We have D, D, G, and A, similar to our first phrase, the end of our first section. Very similar, actually. So that we know that a 5 chord is being implied here, but this G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This A is a chord tone, this F sharp is a chord tone, this E is not a chord tone, this B is not a chord tone, and similarly to the ending of the second phrase, we have C sharp or C natural occurring at the same time as the F sharp as it resolves, turning it into a dominant 7 chord, so we'll just change the figured bass, and then we cadence on 1, G, B, D, and G. Perfect authentic cadence in the key of the tonic, and that is today's analysis. Pretty interesting chorale. I still am up in the air about my analysis at the end, or sorry, not at the end of the first system, but at the beginning of the second section, the B section. All in all, I think what matters is you sort of follow your ear. If I didn't really feel bogged down by traditional vocabulary, I would have no problem just continuing to analyze in the key of G. But that C sharp, this F sharp minor chord right here really throws me for a loop. Like, are we going into G Lydian for a bit? The more that I listened to it, and maybe it was psychosomatic, it started to sound more like B minor because of the A sharp that occurred afterwards, but it sort of coinciding with E minor at the same time as well. They're all very close to one another, just the C sharp is what's separating them. C sharp is even often used in the key of E minor as the raised 6th, but the fact that we have C sharp and D natural, and we also have B minors throughout, it really does feel more like a B minor collection that ends on E minor, maybe even staying in the key of B minor and then moving like a subdominant cadence in the key of B minor. But it really doesn't sound like we've moved out of the realm of G major to me intuitively. Like if I'm following my ear and my gut, it doesn't sound like we've moved or have modulated beyond just B minor exclusively. Like that little fragment right there does feel like a tonicization. Maybe like I analyzed a modulation, I think it did cross the line. It dedicated the majority of the phrase to it, but the melody really carries it and makes it feel like we're in the key of G major. So there's some disagreement there, and that occurs from time to time, but I chalk it up to the fact that the music that's happening here is a byproduct of counterpoint, and it's not exclusively about chords occurring on the downbeats of the harmonic rhythm, and I think I'll leave the analysis at that. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel. If you're interested, if this is the first video that you're watching of mine, feel free to subscribe if you're catching me while I'm filming this series. I'm currently analyzing all of the chorale harmonizations that have been attributed to Bach. It's a very lengthy collection of pieces. There's like more than 400 of them, so I have tons of videos planned for the future, and I upload once a day. So if you want a daily dose of Bach or just daily dose of analysis in general, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification button, and you'll be notified of when I upload a video. But on that note, thank you again so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.